there are a number of anomalies of recent happenings which political science neither anticipated nor really has, I think, an adequate understanding or even good working hypotheses about. I won't go through the list. The most obvious ones are the collapse of the Soviet type of polity. There are certainly aspects of contemporary democracy in the West, declines of various kinds of voting, party membership, etc., which remain to be convincingly explained. And we can go down a list of phenomena, I think, that political scientists are not particularly, do not seem to be anyway, particularly well equipped to deal with. They're improving it, but my idea is that maybe it's because they're building their research on outdated micro foundations, and therefore let's excavate a bit and try to understand what these foundations are. The raw materials are, I think, 5, and then I've got a 6th one in there which I don't think most people think about very much anymore, but certainly did in the past. Agents, motives, mechanisms, regimes, units, and then telos, direction of change. Let me just say a few things about that, each one of those, and then let's see, if you want more detail, it's in the paper. It's better to have more of a discussion. The first thing, of course, is you must have an idea of who the agents of politics are. And the important thing, of course, is that politics have agents. That is to say, there are actors. We'll see in a minute they don't have to be human beings. People and organizations thinking about micro-foundations in terms of agents, not as individual persons, but as organizations. This has radical consequences, incidentally, for how you see politics, because it makes a lot of the so-called dilemmas, the dilemma of collective action. The dilemma of collective action has been already solved. Everybody's organized one way or another, for example. So there's a whole series of problems raised by especially rational theories which make no sense whatsoever. In fact, empirically, they make no sense because there are an awful lot of groups, rather large groups, consumers, women, etc., who are pretty well organized in many societies, and therefore they are organizationally present in ways that simply make no sense from the point of view of Mansur Olson or whoever follows them. The second is motives. And here, political science has often, long before its infiltration by neoliberal economics, political scientists have always assumed, not always, usually assumed, that politics was a matter of self-regarding interests. Why are people motivated to act as agents, or in this case, organizations? Because it's in their interest to do so. Okay? But passions are still around, right? The most obvious one that keeps popping up is nationalism, or let's say collectivism of some kind or another, whether it's nationalism at a subnational, national, whatever level. There's still plenty of passions around, and so even capitalism has not been able to make all agents into interest maximizers and self-regarding interest maximizers. So passions then become periodic, if not permanent, at least their importance then seems to keep appearing, reappearing in various places, and especially, of course, during periods of transition where the rules are ambiguous and therefore the capacity of actors to mobilize others is ambiguous, and therefore passions of various kinds, particularly, of course, ethnic, religious, linguistic, or whatever it is, become a very appealing device for mobilizing collectively. Mechanisms. The obvious one for most political scientists is competition, and even more narrowly, electoral competition. And that's an awful lot of political science has been devoted to studying electoral competition. And it's also presumed that most electoral competition takes place between political parties, so there's an orderliness, so you've got a whole series of assumptions prior to that about how the electoral process is structured, both in terms of its its own terms, but also the agents that are present in the process. I have not much to say, except that that's not adequate. So most of us, myself, as I think Stefano mentioned, I've been much more interested in what I call policy competition, in which the central actors have almost always been interest groups of various kinds, local government, different levels of collectivities, but essentially interest groups and social movements. Regimes. It is usually assumed in those micro-foundations that the units, the polities that we are studying have something like a regime, a set of relatively stable, coherent institutions that you can label. In the past, there used to be a democratic, totalitarian, and authoritarian. The most interesting discussion now among those of us who work on democratization is the idea of hybrid regimes. Regimes that mix democracy and autocracy. And the big question is that a stable form? And can we associate hybrid regimes with particular properties of agents, motives, mechanisms, etc.? Do they have their own distinctive mechanisms rather than simply being uncertain compromises that are on the way to being something else? So that's where the discussion is among those of us who've been looking at those problems. Finally, we come to what is in many ways the most important, and to many of you it's going to seem obvious. So the question then is, what is the appropriate unit for analysis? We are pretty convinced that it should be something called a polity. The problem is that the polity is no longer, or can no longer be exclusively associated with sovereign national states. They are not sovereign anymore, and they are not national, most of them, and they don't even, in many, many cases, have this famous monopoly or legitimate monopoly over organized violence, to use the Bavarian definition. Finally, in a lot of political science, until I think recently, one of the important aspects of the micro-foundation was this belief that all this was going somewhere, that there was a telos to politics. Certainly, if you've been around at the time of Woodrow Wilson and a few others, that telos was pretty obvious. Everybody was going in the direction of liberal democracy, and it was just a matter of time before the enlightened policies of, especially the United States and Great Britain, would somehow, they were in the vanguard of this. I think we now realize that we don't have a telos. Movements in various directions can be observed.